All right, here we go. Hey, welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Deeper Podcast. I'm your host, Demetrius Colbert. I'm so excited to have you here today. Thanks so much for tuning in for just a few moments. I do want to encourage you to listen to this in its entirety. If you have to break up and listen to it in bits and pieces, that would be great. That would be okay, but it'd be great if you could just take the opportunity to listen to this entire interview. I have a very, very special guest with me here today who I connected with, believe it or not, over TikTok. I saw some of his TikToks and I believe he saw some of mine. We just kind of liked, and then, we connected as friends on TikTok, and I'm all about having broader discussions. And this gentleman brings that to the table for me. He doesn't speak with vitriol. It doesn't come across in such a way where it's demeaning, where it's trying to tear people down, different things along those lines. And I enjoyed that, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have him here as a guest. But it's truthful, and that's really important that we are able to speak truth in this, especially in a moment like this in our country. I think it's important that we could speak truth. And here's something I want to just kind of give everybody a heads up about. Okay, and it's this: you do not have to agree with anything that Scott or myself says. Here's what we do want you to do: we want you to be able to be coherent. We want you to be able to vet things appropriately. We want you to be able to receive new information perhaps that doesn't land in the sphere that you live in the place where you function all the time. What we're going to talk about today here is some race, religion, and culture. And to be quite honest with you, as soon as these things come up, it becomes problematic for a lot of people. It becomes a scenario and situation where people just say, yeah, I'm tired of hearing that. Yet we take in information all the time from social media, from regular media, right? From news that may, in fact, be slanted towards their viewers, different things along those lines. That could be papers, that could be whoever your particular source is, it could be there. What we're going to do is we're just going to have a open and honest conversation here about some things. Does Scott have a bent? Yes. Do I have a bent? Yes. But when we zoom out and we give ourselves a broad opportunity to hear from different people in different spheres and have just a different understanding of information, it can end up being an amazing opportunity for us to not only learn, but to also grow and to understand other people that we may disagree with. And I think that that's really important for us to speak about on a regular basis. Again, especially with the level of discourse or lack thereof, I should say, that we have going on in the country. All right. So without further ado here, I want to introduce you to Scot Loyd. Again, Scott, I was going to go over all of your credentials, but I do want you to tell people exactly what it is that you are currently doing. Scott is definitely a well-educated man, and I'm going to give Scott an opportunity to introduce himself to you, and then we're going to jump into some conversation with one another. So, Scott, tell us some more about yourself.
Absolutely, Demetrius. It's a honor to be here, and I appreciate everything that you had to say. It's so helpful, especially in the day and age in which we are living. I am currently serving as an oral historian at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And prior to that, for 20 some odd years, I was a communications professor at three different institutions of higher education. During that time, I also coached collegiate competitive speech and debate teams
Oh,
all over
wow.
the
Okay.
country. So it's been an honor, and you and I did connect on TikTok, and exclusively there, I talk about race, culture, and religion. Those are sort of the intersections of my interest and my fields of study. I have two master's degrees, one in communication studies and one in heritage studies, which is how we receive and how we interpret history. And I think you're on to something when you talk about the fact that all of us have biases, right? We all have to recognize that we look at the world from a certain perspective, that we have a certain lens. through which we make judgments and we leverage our values and we focus in the world. And a lot of that has to do with where we were born, the time of our birth, and the geography of our birth. So there's an old saying that I think is absolutely true, that in a lot of respects, geography is destiny. If I would have been born
Mhm.
elsewhere, um, instead of being born in the Mississippi River Delta of rural Arkansas in 1971, my life would have been very, very different. But that is my context and that is my lens. And as it has to do with race, I grew up in a predominantly African American city. And even though my family and I, by all statistical standards, we were poor, I began to notice that I was treated differently than my peers who were Black. And some of the things that I noticed, especially now, as I began to reflect on my background, is that no one ever treated me as a suspect. Everyone was always willing to help me and to really go out of their way to help me. And no one ever crossed the street to avoid making contact with me. And and at the end of a routine traffic stop, I never feared for my life. Now, if you listen to Black Americans in our nation right now, and this has been going on for a long time, repeatedly you will hear them express concerns about all of those issues that I just raised, that they are treated differently. And when we throw out this term white privilege, a lot of times people get offended by that. But it doesn't mean that you weren't poor. It doesn't mean that you didn't have to work hard. It just means that in the United States, there is a different experience, people who are white and people that are Black. And we need to acknowledge that if things are going to change.
Wow, that is that's we're off to a really good start here. But this is the very reason why I wanted Scott to be here. And as a black man, um, I certainly can absolutely positively agree with a lot of what Scott has said. Now, having interracial kids, my wife is white, and I have all girls, and their experience as what is seen in culture as black women, they're seen as black women, even though their mom is white. They are in fact seen as black women, but their experience is a little different than mine. And Scott, maybe perhaps we can talk about that even too a little bit. But what Scott said was incredibly important because this is the conversation that has been had, but a lot of people, Scott, just don't want to. They don't want to get into the nuance of it. They don't want to pull back the
Right.
layers. They don't want to see it. They don't want to deal with it. It's easier for us to say, no, no, that's not it. And I've had people say things like this too, right, to me. Hey, I've had black friends. My parents had black friends, or whatever, whatnot. And Scott, it's just not the same. It's not. It's. I
Right.
think it's. I think they're well-meaning, and I don't even think that these particular individuals are trying to be, quote, racist. I think that they don't understand the privilege piece that you were just speaking of. And so that's where I think that the confusion, if you will, comes in between that. They're like, no, no, I don't see you that way, or I don't feel this way. The truth of the matter is, there's a book out there that talks about the fact that we all have implicit bias. Doctors
Right.
have it, lawyers have it, whoever judges have it. Everybody does, and that's why there's something that we have to practice in order for it to help us not lean into that bias, but do what we're supposed to do for what's in front of us, right? If you're a lawyer or a doctor, right, you're practicing medicine. You don't Doesn't matter who the patient is, you're supposed to be practicing medicine. If you're judging,
Right.
right, you're supposed to be practicing law, right? Whatever the scenario is. But I certainly see where there's a lot of challenge that comes in with that, where people will immediately, Scott, be turned off by the fact that I would say white privilege, and they don't want to hear it because they're like, you have the same opportunities that I do, and so on and so forth. And they don't understand redlining. They don't understand why suburbs were created. They don't understand how the freeway system was created. They don't understand things that happened with Black Wall Street. They don't, and they're like, yeah, but that happened so long ago. But what they don't understand is the impact that this has continued to have. They don't understand that laws and policy and people in politics and the education system, the banking system, Bank of America, with their poor lending towards people of color, who had to pay out these significant fines when people come in to assess the value of your home before you get ready to sell it. When they walk in, if you don't look like them, but you live in the neighborhood where, hey, these houses are going for a million, million and a half, your house isn't going to get the same valuation. And so it becomes one of those things, Scott, where I know that it is a challenge, and I know that we can get further into that. But let me ask you, let me talk to you from my first question here, because as believers, right, there's a there's a struggle, a challenge that I see with people, specifically Christians, and it's that we have conflated, uh in my opinion, let me not put this on Scott. Let me say, in my opinion, he can answer how he'd like to. In my opinion, Scott, we've decided that being a Republican, in my opinion, is being a Christian, and that Christianity is your Republican,
Yeah.
and so or just being conservative. I'm conservative, but I believe that you can be conservative and have nothing to do with God. You can just be a conservative person. Once
Sure.
again, right? Where you grew up, different things along those lines. For those of you who follow me, obviously you know that I'm also a life coach, and I have a program that I teach called Habits, Appetites, and Decisions. In that, Scott, the first part of that program I teach is I start talking about something you made mention of, the fact that where you grew up has an impact on the habits that you actually carry throughout your life until you
Right.
recognize them, right? There's an impact for them. And so I feel like people don't realize that, hey, maybe I grew up in the Bible Belt. So I'm from the Dallas Fort Worth area. And so I live in Arizona now, but it's one of those things where there are people who, just because of growing up in that space, they're like, we got the buckle on the Bible Belt, right? Different things along those lines. It's just one of those deals. But with your extensive, background, your race, religion, and culture, is like, how do you see the intersection of systemic racism and Christian faith playing out in our modern American society? How do you see that playing out right now?
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right when you say that in the United States there's this conflation of identity politics with cultural Christianity. So this is where an understanding of history is very, very helpful. And you don't have to have training in history like I do to appreciate that we are all receiving a legacy, a long legacy in the United States that is undeniably racist. And so if you go back to the fact that at our founding as a nation, many of the founding fathers owned slaves. A large portion of this nation was dependent upon slave labor in order to sustain their economics. And even though we fought a civil war to end the institution of slavery, the systemic nature of that racism was never fully addressed. The Civil War was so bloody and it was so costly to the United States that when a victory was finally achieved and the institution of slavery was ended, there was a desire by everyone involved to sort of move on and move past the hurt and the scars of that horrendous war. But what happened was obviously that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by someone who was an avowed racist. And a lot of people in the South saw this as their opportunity for this racism to reassert itself in the form of Jim Crow laws, in the form of these ideas that there is this racial hierarchy
Mm.
that was enforced, and it was enforced in segregated ways all the way through the 1960s. And so, even though we've made progress as a nation, there are a lot of those systemic issues that still exist. Look at any statistic that you'd like to look at, whether it's economic, whether it's in the judicial system, whether it's in the educational system, and you will see that in every statistical category, Black people in this nation are lagging behind the success and the economic well-being, the educational opportunities of white people in this nation. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that, but we're talking generally as a group. And where your idea of Christianity comes in to play with this is that throughout the institution of slavery, throughout all of our history, the Christian church, regardless of denomination, with just a few exceptions, was complicit in endorsing these particular ideas. The church, generally speaking, did not push back against slavery, but found ways to justify it. It did not push back against racism and segregation and Jim Crow, but found ways to justify it. And that continues in a lot of respects to this day. And so what happened was that the Republican Party, in a lot of ways, embracing these ideas of the white dominant culture, saw an opportunity to align itself with the voting bloc of Christianity in the United States as represented by the white communities, and leveraged that as an ability to put people into office, to discourage other people from voting and having power and status. And so that continues to this day. There's a great book. I forget the author's name, but it's Jesus and John Wayne. And it goes
Hmm.
all the way back and sort of traces how all of these connections um, conflated Christianity with Republican ideas, so that today a lot of people consider it anathema, a curse, right? If you are a Democrat and you claim to be a Christian as well, they can't reconcile that in their mind. So it took a long time for us to get here, but we're seeing the negative aspects of that now, where you have 80% of evangelicals in the United States who say that they are voting for a particular candidate, a champion who by any mere observation does not embody the Christian values that they say that they embrace. And so that's where we're at.
I mean, gosh, we're only going to talk for another 40 minutes. We might have to do a part two. Listen,
Sure.
because okay, so again, if you stuck with us so far, we've probably already struck a nerve with you. You're probably already upset about it, but I want to encourage you, keep listening, and bring your heart to this. Bring we're not talking about something that's demonic. We're not talking about something that's anti your faith, your belief. We're talking about something that if you really sit with it, we have to learn to sit with new information, or information that we're uncomfortable with, or that we don't agree with, or that we don't like. And so Kristen Dumais is the one who wrote that book, right?
Thank you.
I read that book as well. In fact, I had a question for you at the end of this regarding history, but I read White Too Long by Robert P. Jones, right?
Mhm.
Who runs an entire organization, nonprofit organization, where he talks about having grown up in Mississippi, having grown up in his church, and the type of church that he went to, and he was like, "Hey, something is not right here. Like, we're talking about we love God and that God loves all people, and brother, we love you and you're welcome and this, that, and other. He goes, but that was not the case with people of color, right? That just we did not allow for people who were black to be there. They'd say, hey, you know what? We believe that God loves them too, just different. The fact that they didn't even consider people, and Robert's probably, somewhere close to our age. I'm not sure how old Scott is. I'm 55. I think
I'm
that
53.
okay, so
Yeah.
there is Robert's probably close to our age. So we're literally talking about the 60s, late 60s and 70s, where this was still a conversation in culture and society, right? I get it, right? MLK was still around. We're still having civil rights, different things along those lines, still fighting for rights. But the amount of books, Scott, that have come out from that I have a list of them here that I've listened to pretty much since 2020, when I started paying more close attention to our politics and Christianity, to be quite honest with you. Um, there's this one, The Christian Imagination, blew my mind. White evangelical racism blew my mind. Jesus and John Wayne. Um, there is The Color of Law. There's just so many different books that I came up, The Whitewashing of Christianity,
Mhm.
that came out. There's so many different books that came out, and people, and here's what surprised me, Scott, I'm gonna be totally honest with you. What surprised me is it was my white brothers and sisters like yourself, Christian Dumay, who were coming out and writing these books. And the reason why I was surprised is because of the people who used to be in my circle. I pastored two churches. I started two churches. I worked for a church pretty much the majority of my life. I spent 11 years in corporate, but for the last 22 years, I basically pastored and worked for ministries. The people who were are no longer connected with me, who don't want to be friends, who didn't like what I had to say about their cultural Christianity. I'm so glad you made mention of that. I was like, I don't see what you're talking about here in the gospel. This whole thing about we want to destroy people.
Yeah.
And this was my thing. This was my thing, Scott. I said to myself, I said, why? This was a question that I had to a couple of these people who, they had a lot of hatred towards me, and I was fine with that because I said, I want you to show me why you believe that it is better to destroy people than it is to win them. Because in the scripture isn't like, hey, destroy them. No, the scripture is that God loves them and that he wants to win them. And I said, we have a tough time reading John 3:17, which is incredibly clear. It says, I did not come to condemn the world, but to win them.
Right.
That's what it says. It says it itself. And so I was like, please show me what scripture you are referring to. And I said, if you start talking about immigrants, the scripture, even in the Old Testament, tells us how we're to do that. If it talks about who is my mother, who is my brother, those who do the will of God. When we get into all of this stuff, if we break it down, I said, if you're going to share something with me, I just want us to be playing in the same ballpark, is all I'm asking you. I don't want you to gaslight. I don't want you to say, hey, I know you're inside the park. I'm outside the park. I'm going to throw you a lob out there and see what you think about it. No, what are we really talking about? Is this true? And then you talked about the Civil War. This was interesting because I read another book that I've read multiple times now. Um, by this guy. His name is Henry Lowen, I believe it is. He wrote a book called Lies That My Teacher Told Me.
Yeah.
James Lowen, Dr. James Lowen, he wrote a book called Lies That My Teacher Told Me. Incredible book, because this was leading to the question that I had for you too. Because what he did was he said, your teacher didn't tell you about this history. He said, in fact, it has been omitted by people who look like me. This is true history. But what has happened is they omitted this history from there. So there are things that you don't know. So he takes and walks down this entire thing. And this book is 13 hours. So he didn't just get on here and say, hey, we're going to take an hour and just try to gloss over a few things. No, Scott, he took literally 13 hours in the second edition of this book because he said there was so much more I wanted to say in the first edition. So here's the second one. What I never knew was why there was a Southern Baptist church. I never knew how the SBC came to pass. I never knew how implicit, as you had made mention of, the SBC was in slavery. I never knew this. I never knew about I understood slavery in general. I understood a lot of what took place from the history that I knew and from what some Black authors had written, but they hadn't really written about what had taken place between Christianity and slavery. Now I understood that there were aspects of that, but I didn't understand the depth of it and how the Southern Baptists split because they said, we want to continue with this slavery. This is
Exactly.
beneficial to us. This keeps
Mhm.
us. And these are the conversations that people don't want to have because their idealist, Scott, is that that's so long ago. We're friends
Mhm.
now. We're
Yeah.
neighbors. You can live in my suburb. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, right. Like I want them to hear, like, listen to what you're saying to me. It's almost like you're giving me permission to live where you live instead of like, hey, everybody, we're just family, we're just people. No, that's not how your mind has even been conditioned, right? So you almost have to feel like you're accepting me as different than you.
Mhm.
And I'm a man just like you, my wife, my
Right.
kids, my grandkids. I want the same things your family wants. Any regular family would love to have. So my question to you, so I don't keep rambling here, is this: do you think the lack of historical insight is the biggest problem to people being able to cross and come to tables and have conversations?
I think that's certainly part of the problem. A lot of people have this concept that history sort of starts on the day that they were born, and they only have an idea of history within the context of their lifetime. And they don't understand how all of us and all of these events growing up, as I mentioned at the outset of our conversation, growing up in a particular geography, in a particular time in the world, in a particular nation, the United States of America, has an impact on me culturally. It has an impact on the choices that I make, the habits that I form, and the things that I identify as quote unquote normal. And so, what I've got to come to tack with as a white male growing up in the United States is that all of this that seems normal, that is catering to me, is a very different experience for you as a Black man growing up in the same context. And I think the reason that a lot of people that look like me are uncomfortable having these conversations is because they don't like to be made to feel uncomfortable. But you know what? I took a math class and I never was good at math, and it always made me feel uncomfortable.
Me either.
But it would be horrendous for me to say, well, uh, I don't want to talk about math. I don't think that math is important. Well, that's ludicrous. We need to understand that there are some things in this world that are going to be uncomfortable, and especially if we are Christians, we have the added responsibility to be the salt and light that Jesus says that we are, to be the authors of reconciliation. And that
Mm,
means coming to terms with all of our history, not a part of it. When people say, well, that was long ago, they forget that all of their faith is built upon a foundation that is 2,000 years old. Jesus Christ lived long ago. The
mm,
disciples lived long ago. And as you were talking, I was reminded of that Old Testament passage of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah is in exile and he is the cupbearer to the king. And one day the king notices that he's all sorrowful and he's like, Nehemiah, what's wrong? And he's like, well, I'm lamenting that my hometown, my nation is destroyed. The walls are crumbling in Jerusalem, and when that happened, that was 150 years approximately removed from that particular event of Jerusalem being overrun and Nehemiah's ancestors and family being taken into exile. And so there was something that rose up within Nehemiah that says, yes, that was a long time ago, but I have a responsibility today
Mm.
to mend the walls, to rebuild the city. And so this is part of it, right? You and I having this conversation.
Yes.
This is what Christians should be doing across our nation because yes, it was 150 years ago, but we still have a responsibility to rebuild those walls, to rebuild that city, and to build a place, the city of God, right? That is welcoming to all, regardless of skin color, regardless of experience, regardless of circumstance. And we need to recognize that we live in a system that has been built to bolster we don't like this word either, but it's what it is, white supremacy.
Yeah,
And so
true.
when we say white supremacy, people always think about the Klan, obviously white supremacists. They think about Nazis with
Sure.
tiki torches, obviously white supremacists. But think about the culture. Think about the fact that I don't have to think about being white in America. I just live my life. I can have this conversation with you, Demetrius, but and then I go back to my quote unquote normal life. My black brothers and sisters, you don't get to escape the thought that I am black in a dominantly white culture. And you have to be ever vigilant when you are around white people because we have a history in this nation of a black man looking at the wrong person or the wrong woman and assumptions and lies being told, and that leading to the death of black men. And you don't have to go very far back in time to see this. I was a kid in the 80s growing up in Arkansas, and I saw a white man beating a black man because he accused him of looking at his daughter for too long.
Mm.
And so that happens in our world. And I have the privilege and I have the luxury because I'm a white American that I can stop thinking about this anytime that I want to. But as a Black American, Demetrius, especially when you're out and about and depending upon who you're around and what's going on, you have to be very careful about what you say or how you behave or what you do because people can jump to those conclusions very quickly. Oh, he's the scary black man. He's the angry black man. And you mentioned earlier why a lot of white people are writing about these topics, and I'm convinced that the reason why not a lot of black people were willing, I think that's changing, but they were not willing to talk about this openly, is because the minute they do, they're labeled. The minute they do, they are marginalized even further. They are pushed back, and they say, "Oh, well, you're just bitter." You're lazy, you're not willing to work hard, you're not willing to access all this opportunity, you're making excuses for your failings. Or if you become passionate about it, oh, that guy's dangerous, he's scary, the big scary black man, right? And it saddens me that we have to talk in those terms, but that's the reality.
That is the reality. And, Martin Luther King was considered a domestic terrorist, basically, because
Yeah,
of his desire for civil rights. Just to say, I just want to be treated like a man when I walk down the street, right? I want to
yeah,
be treated like a human being. And so I'm a domestic terrorist. It reminds me of again, much of the gaslighting and different things along those lines that currently goes on in our politics right now today from what used to be the Republican Party, which is now just a party of grievance and
yeah.
hate and different things along those lines. But in my opinion, um, I feel like this is the thing again that so many people, Scott, don't want to hear. And I'm so appreciative of you and I being able to have this conversation. I have had this conversation with several of my white friends who were curious. I mean, they were genuinely curious. They were like, "Hey, can I come over? I want to sit down. I want to talk to you because I may not know that I have some of these feelings or these biases, or I'm hearing this stuff and I'm thinking to myself, is this who I am?" And they're upset because they're like, I don't actually dislike black people. The part and the reason why I'm saying this, Scott, is because what I believe that they don't understand is what you just said, which is to me the part that I've tried to convey to people quite often, especially those who were detractors. I said, you never have to think like I have to think.
Right.
You never ever, there's never a time where you have to think like I have to think. This has nothing to do with having black friends, having a black spouse, even, or being in proximity to black people. Because if they were in proximity, Scott, they would have many of the insights that you've had and been able to as growing up in this context. And you're like, I see something completely different that I never have to wrestle with. And so I live in a suburb here in Phoenix, and it is predominantly Caucasian. And it's interesting. When we built this house, I was um, I was the fifth house here in this community, and it was interesting. I was going to the mailbox one day, and this family had just moved in, older white couple. They had just moved in, and I'm going to the mailbox getting the mail,
Mhm.
and I wave, just typical, "Hey, how's it going?" And the woman, she's like, "Do you live here?" And so it's kind of one of those things right there. So my immediate my immediate thought was to, you know, kind of be somewhat sarcastic and, so, no, I'm actually just robbing the mailbox. Can I get your key? Right. I was just, because I was thinking to
Yeah.
myself, like, who says that? Right. And somebody might say, oh, no, she was just trying to be friendly and trying to be nice. Maybe she wanted to know something about the community. Scott, we know the difference between someone attempting to be friendly with us and someone saying, shoot, I moved here, didn't know you lived here, probably wouldn't have bought a house here, right? And are you like really close by? That's the feeling that you get. And I don't think that
Right.
people grasp that, right? And it doesn't matter what I drive. This is something that a lot of people
Yeah.
don't understand either. It doesn't matter what kind of car I drive. It doesn't matter how nice my home is. It doesn't matter how well spoken I am. In fact, you probably know this as well, right? Um, there will be people who will say things like this and they don't get it when they say, "Oh, you speak so well."
Yeah.
You don't you
As
it's
compared to what, right?
as compared to what, right? So
Yeah.
you're like, yeah. So, it's this whole thing. Or they'll approach you and they think that they have to do like this, hey, yo, type of thing or whatever, whatnot. And you're like, hey, what's actually happening right here? Because truthfully, I'd rather you say, dude, guy, bro, like do that, right? You don't have to, right? It doesn't have to happen. And I don't think people get that, Scott. I think that they think somehow that, hey man, there's nothing to that, but it is, and it means something to other people, to black people, because black people just want to be treated as equal. And in fact, I know that one of the messages that's being peddled by some white people to make other white people be fearful is that if black people ever get in any kind of charge, right, that they're going to look for revenge. Scott, I can almost 100% say this to you without hesitation. Black people are not looking for revenge,
Right.
period. Equality, yes. Revenge, absolutely not. Black people are not waiting to say, man, I can't wait until we get some kind of, because I'm going to do this. We are not.
And
We're not.
isn't it telling, Demetrius, that white people assume that that is what black people will do? Why? Because that is what white people have done they have mistreated, they have maligned, they have enslaved, and yet they have killed Black people in this nation. So white people assume, even though they may have not had anything to do with any of those atrocities, they assume that if the roles are reversed, that Black people are going to treat white people exactly as white people have treated Black people throughout our history. So there's that great proverb that says the wicked flee when no one pursues.
Hmm.
And so collectively, that's what's happening in the consciousness of white America. And you said something that was really, really interesting that I want to revisit,
Sure.
because throughout our history, you've always had this concept, and you see it predominantly in athletics and in entertainment, that Black people, especially those that are exceptionally talented or exceptionally athletic, are rewarded a lot of times as long as they toe the line, so to speak, in their proximity to whiteness. But the moment they engage in any kind of behavior
Hmm.
that is perceived to be dangerous or divergent, then all of a sudden white America retreats from them. And to me, the perfect example of this is Colin Kaepernick, right?
Hmm.
So you have an exceptionally talented athlete. He leads his team to the Super Bowl, and he engages then in a peaceful protest. And it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree with what he did. What I'm commenting on is how he was treated after the fact.
Hmm.
Here you have a talented person, but the moment as a Black man he expresses his opinion or his feeling about something, it's like he's dead to the world,
Mm.
persona non grata. And you have a lot of examples of that in entertainment and in athletics. It's almost as if Black people exist to entertain us, but the moment they challenge us, or they want us to think, or they make us to feel uncomfortable, there is a lot of different feelings that come up in white America based on that.
So profound, so profound and so true. It's that nuance, right, Scott,
Mhm.
of the things that are overlooked by other people. But Black people know that. Black people feel that, and they understand toe the line, right?
Mhm.
We understand toe the line. Like you got to toe the line here in these scenarios and situations. It's interesting. Again, I've been married for 32 years. I've been with my wife for 33 years, and I was talking to my dad the other day, and he's like, "Son, I'm super proud of you. You've made it this far. I'm the longest married person in my family, outside of his parents, who both have passed away. But it's so interesting, because he was talking to me about, just in general, how I have moved along with, the relationship over the years. And I said that I'm fully aware of the fact that there are some people who accept me because my wife would be with me.
Mhm.
I'm fully aware of that. And there are some people who, no matter what, again, no matter what I achieve or where I ascend to, I'm still just Black. And that's just the way it is. And I pose a threat. And the camera doesn't show it, but I'm a pretty big guy. So, former football player. So it's interesting. One of the things that I had shared with my wife too about just our dynamic was she's short, she's blonde hair, blue eyes, she's Polish, and I, you know, this former football player. So when we go to places, restaurants, different things along those lines, the assumption is, and she didn't see it at first, and
Yeah.
she was like, I do. She's like, you mentioned it and I saw it. Even me having to have this conversation with my wife, she was like, no, they're just being nice. They're just being No, it wasn't just being nice, Scott. What was happening is when people believed that I was somebody, their treatment of me, right? Because they're like, oh, that guy. And she watched it over and over again happen to us at tables. People would they thought that I played professional football here. So the Cardinals are here and they would be like, hey, this guy, this, that, and other, you look like so and so or whatever. They come over to the table, hey, how's it going? Or they'd be like, go Cards. Or I get a really good seat, still do sometimes
Yeah.
in places. And I told her, I said, this is kind of the opposite because if I was somebody else, if this was someone, I promise you, right? I just promise you, I said, there's a way, right? Because I'm not coming in here. I don't have on and I don't have on Dickies, right? I don't
Mhm.
have on a long t-shirt. I don't have this, that,
Right.
or the other. I don't have cornrows, right? And
Hmm.
I don't any of those things. I'm coming in again. I'm an older guy, so just again, in many ways, even dressing in a certain way, they're going to feel like you're towing the line. Like, hey, yeah, okay, you're just
Exactly. Yeah.
acceptable, so on and so forth, or whatever, whatnot. And you're with her. So if she's with
Hmm.
you, then, you got to
Right.
be somebody. You know what I mean? It's kind of
Sure.
those things are not talked about. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, Scott, because I know that that is a real issue, but we're not willing to have that conversation. I think what bothers me personally the most about it, Scott, is that people just want me to get over it. And
Yeah.
what I want people to understand is it's not a matter of just getting over something. I want to be able to be in spaces where the space feels good to me, just as you just alluded to, where it's just as comfortable for Scott. So I walk in the morning. The sun here in Arizona doesn't really rise until about at this time until about six, probably about 6:15. But I start walking about 3 to 5 miles at 5:30. So it's pitch black outside, right? So because we have coyotes and wild boar here and stuff along those lines, I walk with a hit stick. And it's,
Hmm.
it's detractible, right? And
Sure.
so I walk with the hit stick. But listen, I mean, I'm fully aware of the fact that even the color of clothes that I'm walking in, I change
Yeah.
them to bright clothes, Scott, because I typically like to walk. I have a black sweater that's zip up, that's light, but it keeps me warm enough, and we don't really have winter here, but it keeps me warm enough. And I have a black like Nike hat, that's a runner hat, but it's more close to your head, so it keeps your sweat up. Different. Scott, I had to think about that. Do I really want to walk with
Exactly.
this hit stick with these black clothes on, this black hat,
Right.
and so on and so forth? And I got my earbuds in, listening to one of my audio books or whatever, whatnot, so on and so forth. I had to think about that, and I had to switch that up. And then one day, my wife said, "Why are you taking your wallet?" I said, "Because if I get pulled over, babe, while walking, not driving,
Hmm.
pulled
Right.
over, I need to be able to show that I literally live within this community right here." And
Mhm.
she looked at me and she was like, "I'm so sorry that has to happen." And I said, "I have to take my wallet. I have to take my wallet just to take a walk." Now, I will say this, got to be fair to those who are listening to this, who will say, "I think you're doing too much, Demetrius. I think it's not like that. I don't even think about that. I just let people say whatever, whatever, whatever." Here's the thing: I don't think about it every day consciously because
Sure.
subconsciously
Right.
it's
Yeah.
always there. Does that
Yep.
make sense? I
Yeah.
just want them to know it doesn't drive my life, but it does always inform me. It always informs me wherever I'm going, wherever I'm pulling up. Even my neighbors here I have some great neighbors. I have some really great neighbors, especially my two that are literally just to my right and to my left. Good people. We know them. They've been over. We've had coffee, talked all that. One's a former FBI guy. The other one's a former engineer for Boeing, all this other kind of good stuff. But here's what the reality is, and they know this. I will say hi to their wives, but I will not have an ongoing conversation without them being there.
Hmm.
That's Scott, that's just a reality for me.
Sure.
Okay? That
Yeah.
is a reality for me. These other and there's some black people that live in our neighborhood. I'm not the only one, but it's very few, right? But if they wave, I will wave, but you will not catch me having a one-on-one dialogue with any of these women that live here. I just won't. It's perceived as
Right.
a threat.
And that's the reality. And people can say, well, Demetrius, you're overreacting. But remember, it wasn't that long ago. A black man running through a neighborhood in Georgia is killed because the white folks in that neighborhood assumed that he was up to no good, that he had robbed a place. And people say, well, why didn't he just comply? Well, I want to say if somebody points a gun at you and you feel threatened, you're going to fight back. There's nothing in you instinctively that says, hey, these people aren't police officers. They're pointing guns at me and I'm just jogging through the neighborhood. So your concerns are based, unfortunately, in a very sad reality, and that's the context in which we live. So no, you're certainly not overreacting.
And I appreciate that. Again, it's hard to have these conversations with people who don't look like me, because in fact they don't want to engage in these conversations. And the few people, like I said, that I did have the conversations with, Scott, they were apologetic, but I said, I'm not looking for you to be sorry. I need you to
Right.
now become a voice and an avenue for other people to grasp this and understand it so that they don't keep asking me to explain it.
Mhm.
That's, you know what I mean? And that's one of the things that
Absolutely.
I greatly appreciate about you and your mission and what you do and why you do it. Let me ask you this other question here. We won't get to all of them tonight, but let me ask you this question. In your role of managing like oral history at the Abraham Lincoln Library Museum, what stories or narratives have stood out to you in terms of addressing, racial and cultural issues in America?
Well, I'm relatively new in my position, but the some of the stories that I'm hearing from veterans, especially African American stories, detailing their experiences, and what an oral history is basically just sharing your experience during your lifetime. And a lot of these veterans, whether they're World War II, we have a few veterans stories in our collection that are from World War II, a lot of Korean War, and they're just telling their stories. And sometimes they don't even think about how they're telling them, but you can see that they were laboring under a system, right, that was even more oppressive then, and they were fighting for the values that all of us believe in the United States, values of freedom and liberty, and they felt an obligation to serve their country. But when they would come back, they noticed that they were treated very differently on the home front than they were even on the battlefront. There was a level of disrespect, no matter how much they had given, how much they had sacrificed, how much they had served. And so when I listen to these stories, and by the way, if you want to communicate the truth of the experiences that we're talking about, as a white person, if you are a white person, listen to what Demetrius said, and do research. There are lots of books out there. A lot of times, the instinctual thing that a white person will do is to go to Demetrius and say, tell me how you're oppressed, right? Or and it's laborious and it's
Mm,
exhausting. And
really
it's
is.
not their responsibility to explain to us, who have created this system and who have received this system and continue to perpetuate it, because there's the information is out there. People want to avail themselves of this information and understand the experiences of Black people. There is plenty of material. There are oral histories. You can educate yourself. And if there are things that you don't understand, approach your Black friend in with intellectual humility, and don't expect them to explain everything to you. But once you educate yourself, and once you spend time looking at these things deeply, then from an educated position, then you can approach people. But don't put the burden on those that are oppressed by a system to explain to you how the oppression works. That's don't do that. That's exhausting. That's tiresome. And I want to share with you, and I want to touch base with this. One of the things that started my journey really in depth was, like for a lot of people in this nation, was in 2020, the murder of George Floyd.
Mm,
We all witnessed that and the horrendous thing that it was. And I started reflecting after that, really specifically about a journey that I had as a young man growing up in rural Arkansas. And before George Floyd's murder, I had been in my studies, and a lot of things were explained to me. For instance, there was a massacre in Elaine, Arkansas in 1911. And I grew up in Arkansas, and I was in my mid 40s before I'd ever heard about this massacre.
mm,
I was in my mid 40s, mid to late 40s before I'd ever heard about what happened in Tulsa
mm,
massacre. I remember sitting in a junior high class, history class, and I was a kid and I had a white history teacher, and he's teaching about slavery in the United States, but he's perpetuating this lie, that all the slaves had a good relationship with their masters. They were well taken care of, they were fed, they were housed. And even as a seventh grader, a kid, I raised my hand and I said, but they were still slaves, right? And I want you to know, Demetrius, in that moment, my teacher was so offended. He accused me of being obnoxious and made me go sit out in the hallway.
wow.
So that was the context I was growing up in, and I didn't know a lot of this was
Wow.
happening. And I had a friend that, like a lot of churches in the 1980s, they did this thing called bus ministry. It's really cringy now if you think about it. Uh, but we'd go into black communities, right, and pass out candy and invite kids to Sunday school. And there was a black young man that came, and he was about my age. So we became really, really good friends. And he and I grew up sort of in that church and came of age. And after the murder of George Floyd, I started reflecting on the experiences that my friend had and how difficult it must have been
Mm,
in that predominantly white church, going to that predominantly white youth camp with me, and just all of the things that he must have experienced that we never talked about. First of all, we were kids. We didn't have the capacity to talk about it.
right.
We didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it. But I know now that he was experiencing it every day. People would talk to me and pat me on the back and say, "You're such a good young man for bringing your black friend to church with you." They wouldn't say a word to him. He was invisible, right? And nobody said anything to him unless he looked at one of the white girls in the youth group the wrong way. Or if there was ever the inkling that he had any interest, they would put him in his place very, very quickly. His name was Roy. We grew up in that church together. When we became teenagers, we graduated. He went into the army, and we kind of lost touch with one another. And sadly, a few years later, I learned that Roy had passed away because of a brain tumor,
Mm,
and he died. And so after the murder of George Floyd, I really started reflecting on this, and I just sort of out of a moment of emotion, I wrote a letter to Roy, and you can go to my blog post and read it. It's called Just a Letter to Roy. And um, in that moment, I kind of expressed what I was feeling, and the response to that was just overwhelming. It went viral, and but in that moment, Demetrius, I even learned some things about myself, that even though everything that I was writing came from a good place, good intentions, there are even moments in that letter, if you read it, I've got them highlighted, and and people pointed out to me, "Hey Scott, you're still being racist here. You're still centering your white self in
mm,
this story." And I was like, at first I was like offended, right? Because I'm trying to do a good thing here. And they said, "No, you need to
sure.
listen to me." And there was one guy that really called me out, and he and I had a conversation, and it turned out well. But I learned that I still have, even from a place of good intention, I can still react in ways that are racist. And again, all racist is prejudice plus power. So, yes, black people can be prejudiced, but they can't be racist because they've never been in a position of
Of power.
power in the United States. And so that's the distinction. And because I'm in a place of privilege, even though if I'm trying to apologize and do the right thing, when I say cringy things, it's still cringy and it needs to be pointed out to me so I can make corrections. So what I did with that letter is I left it as I wrote it instead of going back and correcting it. And in those places that are problematic, you'll see embedded links to go and read some of the corrections that I received. But throughout that experience, and that letter still resonates and gets hundreds of views every day from people all over the world. From that experience, I really started doing a deep dive into myself and learning and listening to Black people and trying to understand, and still a work in progress. And it's
Yeah.
all of us are on this journey together. We'll
Yes. Yes.
never arrive, but we've got to keep working towards that promise of what the United States and I'm convinced that Thomas Jefferson, he didn't even know what he was writing. When
Mm,
he said, all men are created equal, that was
mm,
something that Abraham Lincoln latched onto. That was something that Frederick Douglass latched onto
mm,
and said, hey, we're going to live up to our promise. That's something that Dr. King latched onto and said,
mm.
that was the idea. And the United States has never, to this day, lived up to that ideal. But we've still got to strive towards it. We got to keep making progress toward that goal.
We have to do a part two. But
Yes,
there
sir.
are there are I do a couple of things before we wrap up. I do want people to know how to contact you and to read the letter. Scott did tell me about the letter. I have not had the opportunity to read the letter myself, but I'm going to read it myself and post it if you don't mind, Scott, also on
Sure.
is it free letter?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So if you'll go to Scott Loyd, ScotLoyd.blog. So scottloyd.blog. It's pinned at the top. It says a letter to Roy, and it's very easy to find. In fact, when we finish here, I'll send you the link in the email so you can have it and you can post it and
Perfect.
share it. And yeah, that's the one that garnered a lot of attention, especially back in 2020 and 2021, but it's still getting a lot of attention.
Perfect. I'm going to attach it to my website as a thing to read, and also my blog post from my website as well. Um, Here's a question. I left some questions on here, but you hit on something that I want to end with here. And again, hopefully you'll agree to do a part two with us because I think that there's so much more meat on this bone to kind of vet out and talk through.
Sure.
Um, how, Scott, for you, because there are going to be white people who see this, the clips of it, because it's going to be cut up in clips and it'll be entirety and it'll be in the podcast space on Spotify. But there are going to be white people who say, what am I supposed to do then if I
Mhm.
feel this way? So I just heard what Scott said. He created links to this place where somebody called him out, but his heart was in the right place. Totally. I think we get that. But there and I can see where somebody could be on the other end of that, including yourself initially, right? Where you said, hey, I kind of felt some kind of way. I was pouring my heart out here, right?
Yeah.
So can you speak to a white person who's saying, yeah, I heard what he said, but I kind of feel the same. I kind of feel some kind of way. I haven't even read Scott's letter yet. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to act? What is the pathway, Scott, to the way you see it, at least, to understanding like I don't need to be offended, and this is how I need to view this. How would someone get over it in essence? Or and I shouldn't say
Yeah.
get over it,
Sure.
reconcile it
Yeah.
to be able to deal with it appropriately.
Yeah. And there's a saying in the military. I was never in the military, but I've read about it, and embrace the suck. Right.
Mm,
So when something's hard and it's going to suck, You have to embrace it and go through it. So a few years ago, I always use this analogy. I'm not like you. I'm not an athlete by any stretch of the imagination. I was the manager, right, in high school, which meant that I managed to bring a cup of water to
I
the
got
athletes.
you. I got you.
But a few years ago, I started taking my health a little bit more seriously, and I wanted to try something that would challenge me. So I went to a CrossFit gym.
Mm,
And if you know anything about CrossFit, it's really rigorous. A lot of young people are involved. But I said, you know what? I'm going to try to do some of these things, and I'm just going to check my ego at the door. I'm not competing with these young folks. I'm just going to do what I can do at my
sure.
pace. And I did it, and I stayed with it. And one
Yeah.
of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to do a handstand, and I can't do it, but just in the middle of the floor. But I said, I want to do it up against the
It's the
wall. I've never
wall.
done one of those. And it took me 2 years, Demetrius, 2 years to be
Mm,
able to accomplish that. But now I can do it just fine. And I can even do some of those reverse push-ups a little bit, right? That are
okay.
really, really hard.
Yeah.
Um, so what I had to do through that situation was, look, I'm going to feel uncomfortable. I'm going to feel a little self-conscious, right? When I'm out here trying to lift my measly little 25-pound bar, and these guys are bench pressing like hundreds of pounds. But you know what? If I want to get better,
Yeah.
then I'm going to have to embrace this.
Yeah.
And so when you start talking about these issues of race, and you're going to, as a white person, you're going to feel offended. You're going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to feel very self conscious. You're going to feel defensive. And you need to understand that all of those feelings are normal. But in order to break through to something that's better on the other side, a better way of thinking, a better way of understanding, you have to commit to working through that. And what a lot of people do is they get to a certain spot and they say, well, I'm too uncomfortable. I'm going to check out. And really, if we all have that attitude, nothing will ever
Mm,
get better in our nation.
yeah.
If you think about this in terms of what you would be willing to do for your family,
Mm,
what you would be willing to do for your spouse or for your children or for your grandchildren to see to it that they're in a better place. So if you can imagine what this country could be in 25 years, 50 years. And it could go either way, right? It could be really bad or it could be better. And so I try to think about my grandkids and the type of world that
yeah.
I want to leave them, and the type of legacy that I want to leave behind. And I understand that in order to do that, that I've got to work first on myself because I can't change anybody else. The only person that I can truly change is myself. The only feelings that I can control, that I can regulate, that I can deal with are my own. The only thoughts that I can deal with and change are my own. The only behaviors that I can change are my own. So if I commit to working on that on the other side of it, I'm going to be better. And now, 2 years later, I can do that handstand. I'm still not an athlete by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm stronger. I'm more fit than what I was when I started that process. And in the same way, I'm learning more about the issues of race and racism and systemic issues in our nation. And I'm making a commitment, at least as far as I'm concerned, to be better and to do better. And if we all embrace that idea, collectively, we can make a better world for someone else in the future.
Man, I love that, Scott. Thank you so much more for your time. I think that all progress and change starts with one person taking accountability for themselves, responsibility, right? To start the ball rolling, right? To get some momentum going down a pathway. And so someone might be thinking to themselves, well, I can't change everybody in my neighborhood. Change you.
Right.
Change you.
Yeah.
You don't need to change everybody in your neighborhood. Change you. I don't have to. My family. I grew up in this. Change you. Tell them
Yep.
these are things I'm exploring. These are conversations I'm having with myself. These are questions that I'm asking. I'm reaching out beyond what I know to understand. It has nothing to do with being against anything. It's I don't understand. There's things I don't know. There's things I inherited that I don't necessarily believe and or agree with. And I need to know what they really are. And they don't fit me. They don't fit where I'm going, what I'm doing. And so Scott, this again, we literally could have talked on here this time for 3 or more hours, just going on and on. There was so much, even more questions. And again, when you start having conversations like this, there are other things that pop up, folks, with these kind of things that are a part of the branches that kind of flow from this tree, right? And the more we could talk about it in a healthy way, you can heal. And this has been so refreshing for me because again, I've never personally met Scott. We met on TikTok. And I just reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast," and he agreed. And so I'm so grateful for you, Scott. Dr. Loyd, in fact, is what we should call him. And so make sure that you grab hold of the information that he gave you. I'm going to have him share it with you one more time so that you know where to get it. And then I'll also post it in the show notes once it goes up on YouTube. And there'll be clips of it. So you'll get clips, and it'll also be connected to some of the shorts as well as in the podcast. But I'm super grateful for you. I'm excited about the work that you are doing. I know that it comes with its own set of challenges, struggles, pushback. I oftentimes will read some of the comments on your TikTok, and I've had to learn to have a high EQ so that I do not fall to the level, right, of some of the thoughts. And I try to even understand where people are coming from a lot of
Sure.
times, right? Because I realize this is probably someone who grew up in, again, one of those contexts where this is all they know. And the first thing they hear is, I'm offended. So they get into their emotions and they're just offended by what they hear without understanding the broader context. So I'm grateful for the work that you do. I'm praying for you. And let's like really try to do this again really soon.
Absolutely, Demetrius.
Um,
Just let me know. Yeah, just let me know when you want to do this again. I'm thrilled and honored to be a part of your program and consider you a brother, consider you a friend, even though we've never met in person, and would be thrilled to do this anytime.
That'd be awesome. So thank you guys so much for joining us here on the Deeper Podcast. Again, make sure that you look for more of this product. You can go to the Dig, which is my primary page, the digg.org, right? That's my ministry page. If you go there, this information will be uploaded there, as well as other information that you can get from there, more videos, things that I've done, teaching that I do, topics that I've talked about, blog posts that are on there. You can also catch my Instagram habits, appetites, and decision if you're interested in working with me from the coaching perspective. I believe that there are 3 ways for us to legitimately transform our lives: is through our habits, the appetites that we have, and our decisions. And so I'm super excited to have the opportunity to share that with you if, in fact, you are interested in having someone coach you so you can transform, not just change, but actually transform your life. So once again, thanks for joining Scott and myself here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again.